The witnesses laid aside their robes at the feet of a young man named Saul. And they went on stoning Stephen as he called upon the Lord and said, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. And falling on his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. And having said this, he fell asleep. Did you notice who's with him in the martyrdom? Who showed up? Jesus. I have no doubt that God's grace is sufficient for whatever crisis you walk through, even if it's martyrdom. And I get it from this text. There are other texts, I don't have time, but we get it from this text. This man's about to be martyred, and Jesus reveals himself to him. This is what happens, beloved. This is what God does. His grace will be sufficient on the day of the crisis. Stand and expect a God encounter. His grace will be sufficient for you. It will be sufficient for you, no matter what it is. Oh, I got fired. God's grace is sufficient. God knows where the next job is. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. It's all His anyway. What are you worried about? Right? Beloved, we just need to actually believe what God says and then go do it. And watch Him do what He does. All we got to do, as I said last week, show up. Just show up in the hard spot, and God will show up as well. You know, I think I've said this to you several times. But Jesus, about 10 times you'll see, it talks about Jesus being at the right hand of God. He's never standing. Never standing. Why is He standing now? He's receiving His first martyr. He doesn't have to stand. He's God. But doesn't it sound like something Jesus would do? He stands to receive His first martyr. I love it. I think it's beautiful. That's not scriptural. That's just Jim's opinion. Stephen looks right through death. I don't have any doubt this is what happens for the believer. Man, you get ready to cross over that border of death. You get ready to cross over, and there he is, man. There he is, just to guide you over, to bring you across. I don't have any doubt this is how it is for the Christian in death. Our God is so awesome. He turns death into praise. He turns death into gain. He turns death into glory. Beloved, that's how awesome your God is. And you're going to live it small? You're going to be afraid to speak up for Jesus in the world? Come on, beloved. Your God is so awesome, you have nothing to fear from death. It's simply a transition into infinite gain. Infinite gain, as Paul says. It's the reason I read the 23rd Psalm. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. Why? Someone tell me. Because I'm religious, and I was baptized when I was 8. And I did a bunch of religious stuff. No, God is with me. God is with me. God's always with His people, beloved. That's one of the things we've got to learn as we go through 1 Peter. It's full of suffering, but God is with us, is what Peter keeps saying. God is with us. Whether God delivers or God allows us to stay in the suffering, God is with us. He never doesn't come to His people. He never doesn't come. He always comes. While we can never fully parse all that God is doing, as I said earlier, we can see a few things that God was doing in Stephen's martyrdom. You know the story. Chapter 8, Acts chapter 8, verse 1. And Saul, who's Saul? Soon to be Paul. God's going to invade his life on the road to Damascus. Chapter 8 of Acts, verse 1. And Saul was in hearty agreement with putting him to death. And on that day a great persecution arose against the church in Jerusalem. They were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Verse 3, and Saul began ravaging the church, entering house after house and dragging off men and women. He would put them in prison. Verse 4, therefore those who had been scattered went about preaching the word. Do you see any complex good in the martyrdom of Stephen? You know the church growth strategy of Acts, right? It's not Rick Warren's book. It's a little more serious than that. Church growth strategy in Acts. Preaching, prayer, persecution. That's how God grows the church. That's why the church is more vibrant in many places where it's persecuted in the world today. Something happens when the church is not persecuted. Something happens. We become complacent, I think. We become complacent. But the church is scattered. And the word is being preached. And I have no doubt that Saul never forgot what he saw Stephen do. It was Stephen's occasion to give testimony to the future apostle Paul. And he did. I have no doubt God used that. I have no doubt that Paul never forgot what he saw that day. Beloved, we saw it in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6. God says, your trials are necessary. That's what he said. He says, it's necessary. You know, the Christian suffering, it's never meaningless. It's never non-essential. If you're suffering, there's purpose in it. It's the tapestry thing. You're just supposed to believe that and talk that and walk that and do that for your family to see, your friends to see, your co-students to see, your co-workers to see, the people in the church to see. You know, when Karen walked through cancer, man, she was a champ. She was a champ. And everybody in church saw it. You couldn't help but love her more, right? And just see how she fell on God and trusted God. That's what I'm supposed to see in your life, beloved. And my faith is supposed to be built up as I watch you. Just as your faith is supposed to be built up as you watch me go through a hard thing and fall on Christ. It's important that we get these things. We learn these things and we live these things. As I told you last week, we laid this groundwork last week in Hebrews 11. And I'm just going to repeat a couple of key points from that sermon because it's so important that we understand these things. We talked about Piper last week. He said you can't be a Christian, really, if you don't understand that God is sovereign in your trials. And you don't understand that it's necessary. And you don't understand that it's good for you in the long run. And you don't understand it's for the glory of Jesus. And you don't understand that it's for your joy. If you don't understand these things, you really can't be a Christian. You'll never be a disciple. Because when it gets hot, you'll run. When it gets hot, you'll deny the Lord. When it gets hot, you'll keep your mouth shut. You got to know God has brought this into your life. You got to know it before it happens, or you'll wilt like a 2-week-old rose. You'll wilt. You got to be ready, beloved. That's what this is all about, man. That's what this 1 Peter book is all about. Be ready. You're chosen. You're peculiar. You're born again. You have an imperishable inheritance waiting for you. I'm sovereign in your trials. Go live it, beloved. That's what we've been talking about. You've got to believe and understand that God is doing something mysterious and something beautiful and something complex in your life when it gets hard. You've got to believe that. If you don't believe that, you can't be a disciple because you will not go with Jesus when it gets hard. So, God decides when to deliver His people from suffering, and He decides when to sustain them in the midst of that suffering. This is God's prerogative. In the faith of His people, sometimes God supernaturally delivers us from suffering. In the faith of His people, sometimes God supernaturally satisfies in the midst of that suffering. As we saw so vividly last week in Hebrews 11, By faith some escaped the edge of the sword, verse 34, and by faith some were put to death.